Good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. It's nice to be back and nice to see everybody. This morning's talk comes at the intersection of one or two different ideas. It's the first morning service of the year, and a couple of times the suggestion has arisen that it would be nice to hear some Dharma teaching about the chants that we do during morning service. And I think it's appropriate maybe to start the morning service Sundays of the year by talking a little bit about the first thing we chant. The first chant that we do in the service. Why don't you just look at it on page 2? Grab your sutra books. Of course, I'm talking about Attadipa. So I think it's nice to talk a little bit about this chant at the top of the morning service. And also, one of the other intersecting ideas here is some of us have recently concluded doing a short series about the Pali Canon. And so some of those ideas are in my mind. This chant, Attadipa, comes from the last sutta in the Pali Canon. Chronologically, the last sutta in the Pali Canon. It comes from the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which is the sutta that recounts the final days of the Buddha up to his death. And this Attadipa is a short bit excerpted from that long sutta. So I want to try to back up a little bit. So, I am one of the junior Dharma teachers here, and so only 25% kidding. It's appropriate for me, I think, to be covering some of the basics, right? I'm in charge of the junior Dharma. So the Pali Canon, what do we know about it? Do we know anything about the Pali Canon? Some of you who are in the course should know a little bit, but does anyone not really have any idea what the Pali Canon is? Okay, right. So this is why we cover this stuff sometimes. So anybody who does know, briefly, what is the Pali Canon?
It's the earliest scriptures of the Buddha.
Yes, the earliest Buddhist scripture, supposedly containing what material?
The original discourses and words of the Buddha.
Yeah, so the Pali Canon is split into 3 sections called the Tipitaka or Tripitaka, which literally means the 3 baskets. So it's gathered into 3 baskets, one of which is what you just said, allegedly the original oral teachings of the historical Buddha. One of the other baskets is the Vinaya, the code of discipline for the original Sangha, meaning the home-leaving Sangha, those who had gone forth to live in the woods, basically, live on alms with the Buddha. And the third basket is the Abhidhammas, which is sort of like it's a bit more structured teaching of the Buddhist philosophy of mind, you might say. So the Sutta Pitaka, the one that has the discourses of the Buddha, that's the one we're talking about right now. And how is it organized? How is the Sutta Pitaka organized? Come on. So you might glibly say it isn't. It's organized based on things like, for example, one of the sections is the Digha Nikaya, which is the long discourses of the Buddha. So this section of the Sutta Pitaka, this is just the longest discourses clustered together in a book. So there's no thematic organization here whatsoever. There's no chronological organization here whatsoever. The last words that the Buddha spoke land right about here in the long discourses of the Buddha. And then everything after that is stuff that came before that, chronologically, right? So if you're trying to read the Pali Canon like a fiction novel, that doesn't work out so well, right? It's just not put together that way. The rest of the Sutta Pitaka is organized along similar principles. So there's the long discourses, there's the medium discourses, there's the numbered discourses where the Buddha's teaching focuses around some number of some sort. And of course, you get all kinds of different topics mixed together in there because the Buddha often taught in numbered teachings, partly for the sake of his listeners memorizing it, his listeners remembering what he said, right? So before we dive further in, does anyone have questions right now about what the Pali Canon is? Why do we call it the Pali Canon? That's a good question. What is Pali? I know many of you know. You can shout it out.
The language that the Buddha spoke.
Right, the language that the Buddha spoke, or probably not historically actually, is probably a language close to the language that the historical Buddha spoke. But it's an ancient language of the Indian subcontinent. We're talking about 500 to 600 years before the Common Era. So 500 something BCE is when the historical Buddha lived. And one interesting feature of the canon that might not be obvious to us modern people is none of it was written down for probably centuries after the Buddha died. It was it was maintained by oral tradition, by recitation, by oral teaching from one person to another person. And that sustained it for a long time until it was written down. Are there any other questions about the Pali Canon? Okay. So turning more directly to this chant, Attadipa. I'll read the English translation quick. Translates roughly to, you are the light, or a little more literally, you are an island unto yourself. Dwell as an island unto yourself, or dwell in the light of yourself. You are the refuge. Have no other as your refuge. The island of Dharma, the light of Dharma, refuge of the Dharma. Have no other as your refuge. I think maybe to translate it a little more straightly, you are the light, or you are an island unto yourself. Rely on that. Don't rely on anything else. The Dharma is a light or an island unto itself. Rely on the Dharma. Rely on nothing else. So if we understand that this passage, this little poem, occurs in the Buddha's teaching during his final days, think about what that makes this mean. Why would the Buddha be saying this particularly? What is the question that this little verse addresses?
What do we do after you're gone?
Exactly. The Buddha announced 3 months before his death that he would be dying 3 months from now. And a lot of the Mahaparinirvana Sutta describes the Buddha traveling from place to place to place to place to place to place. And in each place, he gives a comprehensive discourse, a deliberate attempt to put down as widely as he could in his last days, this is what I'm teaching. And so in the sutta, it says several times, we go to such and such a town and the Buddha gave a comprehensive discourse. This is morality. This is concentration. This is wisdom. Okay. And you can imagine he's got a large assembly of followers. As he travels in these last 3 months, more and more people come to join him on the last pieces of his wandering journey. And some of them are wondering, you told us you're going to pass away. what are we supposed to do after that? Because clearly, right now, you, Gautama Buddha, you're the teacher, and we all come to you as the final reference. What then? And this is what he has to say. You are the light. And I have read a couple of places that the more literal translation is you are an island. So take it whichever way it means more to you. But you are an island unto yourself. However you translate it into English, the clear point is you rely on yourself and you rely on the Dharma. The Buddha was very nonchalantly confident that he had taught everything he needed to teach, and that anybody who had questions after he passed away would be able to refer to what they had heard him teach to settle those doubts. Okay? And I think partly this is interesting because it still applies to us today, right? We don't have the Buddha walking around to question, but we do have this massive body of teaching in the Pali Canon, plus everything that's been taught by centuries of subsequent teachers and scholars and commentators. And maybe I just wanted to make a couple of other comments about features of this Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the sutta that describes the Buddha's last days. So, one interesting feature is, who was the Buddha's successor? In the monastic calendar, we chant this every day.
Mahakashyapa.
Yeah, Mahakashyapa. But how did Mahakashyapa become the Buddha's successor? The salient feature here is that the Buddha did not appoint a successor. Ananda asked him specifically, who should we turn to after you pass away? And the Buddha says this chant that we chant at the beginning of the service, turn to yourself. And then he specifically says, I am not appointing anyone else to lead the Sangha after me. And then, which seems even stranger to us modern people, he said, if someone feels like they should be the leader, then let them be the leader. Right? So I think it's worth dwelling on that idea for a second. Here's this teacher. Whatever cloud of uncertainty there is around the historical details of the Buddha's life, I think we can confidently say that his teaching radically changed the lives of hundreds or thousands of people during his own lifetime. There was clearly a community around him of practitioners, and he apparently knows he's going to die and says, I don't have a successor. I told you all I need to tell you. It's up to you now. And I think there are two other interesting points about this. In the Buddha's last, I think, day of life, he has a large group of followers surrounding him. And he addresses them and says, basically, do you have any questions? I'm going to pass away like tonight. Does anyone have any questions? Don't hold your tongue and then regret saying, oh my gosh, he was here alive in front of us and we didn't ask. And nobody says anything in this huge group of people. And the Buddha asks twice, asks 3 times. And then he goes a step further and he says, maybe someone is embarrassed to ask in front of the whole group. So let that person tell one of his friends and let the friend ask me. Does anyone have any questions that you don't want to say out loud? And nobody says anything. And then Ananda says, oh, how wonderful. I have faith that everybody in this crowd thoroughly understands what you have taught and doesn't have any doubt about it. And Shakyamuni Buddha says, Ananda, you say that because of faith. I know that everybody in this crowd thoroughly understands what I've said and doesn't have any doubts remaining. So that's one way to understand the gist of this first thing we chant, Attadipa. One of the ways I think about this chant is you take the three refuges, the refuge in the Buddha, the refuge in the Dharma, the refuge in the Sangha, and you say, oh my God, the Buddha is going to die. We're taking the first refuge away from the Sangha, and what remains? Well, obviously, the other two refuges. You take refuge in the Dharma, and you take refuge in the Sangha, and interestingly, you take refuge in yourself. So that's what he left his followers with, quite confident that it would work. And I think it's still quite relevant for us today. You know, we're still 25 centuries on practicing this practice, practicing these teachings, and we're able to rely on the record of the teaching that we have, and we are able to rely on living teachers to some degree, and that is wonderful. And we're also able to rely on ourselves, plural and singular, right? Able to rely on the Sangha as a group and able to rely on ourselves. And maybe that's the last thing I want to say about this chant. So maybe it doesn't strike you this way, but to me, it seems like kind of a miracle that the Pali Canon is available to us today. It is so old. It's more than 2.5 millennia old. It wasn't written down for a long time after the original teachings. And maybe that means that there is quite a bit of drift between what is written down in the canon now and what was actually literally spoken way back then. But still, we have this huge body of teaching which is remarkably understandable and remarkably cohesive in what it has to say. And it wasn't the Buddha who transferred it from his own time to now. It was the collective effort of the Sangha over all those years. The Sangha, writ large, is what managed to keep this teaching available over all this time. The Buddha did not imagine a Sangha that had any sort of like, any sort of hierarchical structure, right? He did not imagine there being a person on top of the pyramid who was going to keep everything running smoothly. It was clear that there were a bunch of different little teeny sub-sanghas, you know, people 1 or 2 or 7 or 20 or 100 somewhere in the woods or in a monastery practicing by themselves. And when they had questions, they just asked the wisest person around, you know, asked the most senior practitioner who was available. And I want to underline that also as a feature of the modern day. You know, our abbot now, Chigan Roshi, has one of the clearest elements of his vision for our Sangha is a multi-layered Sangha. A Sangha where there is not one abbot and then everybody else. It's clear that that everybody in the Sangha has some experience, has some knowledge, and can share that with anyone else in the Sangha, right? Even if it's your first day, you have learned something, and whoever walks into the door right after you, you might be able to teach that one thing to that person, which is a very classic Japanese idea about seniority and training. But there's a reality to it. right? I mean, some of you in this room have been practicing for decades, some of you for like maybe weeks or something. You all have absorbed something from that, and you all can share that something. And mutually, it enriches everybody that way, right? So, this first chant we do during morning service, it's part of the historical Buddha's answer to the question, oh my goodness, what do we do once you're gone? And it's a good reminder, what can we rely on? Well, in Buddhism, we say there are 3 refuges. We can rely on the Buddha and the Dharma and the Sangha. And the Buddha, I think, even pushes it a step further. You can rely on the Dharma, and you can rely on the Sangha. And you can rely on yourself, because you yourself can directly verify anything the Buddha said. You can know as certainly as the Buddha knew whatever it is that's worth knowing. So you can rely on yourself. So, those are some things I would say about Attadipa. Does anyone have questions? Okay then.